The sun was just coming up over the ridge. The cool November sky warmed into a spreading pink glow. A few sharp rays of sun striped the forest floor with the early morning shadows of the pines, stretched and misshapen, like reflections in a funhouse mirror. A cloud of warm breath floated lazily up among the branches, shimmered in the sunlight, and slowly disappeared. The chilly morning breeze gusted through the porch, and Don pulled his old denim jacket tighter around his neck. Hunched over and squinting out from under his thick, dark eyebrows, Don looked far older than his 39 years. Dark circles surrounded his eyes, and his mouth hung limp in a loose grimace. He stood up, taking his weight off the rickety wooden railing, and looked back into the cabin. He looked down at the revolver, heavy in his hand, and tucked it into the back of his belt. He pulled out a cigarette and put it in his mouth, but as he brought the lighter up, his hand trembled unsteadily. He was shaking. He couldn't get the cigarette to light. He tried again, and finally flicked the unlit cigarette away with a disgusted grunt. Don spun on his heels at the sound of a chair scraping across the floor inside. Cautiously, he stepped towards the door, treading as lightly as he could. One of the ancient floorboards creaked in protest. Don winced and froze. His heartbeat pounded furiously in his ears. In the silence, his breathing sounded loud. Too loud. Someone had to have heard him. Slowly, he reached back and pulled out the revolver. He painstakingly inched closer and closer to the door. Don leaned in to try and get a glimpse through the window. There she was. She told him she was going to visit her mother. Bullshit. He swallowed hard, and his eyes began to mist over at the sight of his wife, sitting at another man's table. A ceiling fan with a lamp hung over the table, bathing the kitchen in a surreal yellow light. She was folding some papers and smiling to herself, and damned if she didn't look happier than he'd seen her in years. Don felt sick. He didn't know why he'd decided to follow her. Maybe it had been something in her voice, or the way that she'd looked away when she told him she was going to her mother's. He couldn't exactly put his finger on it, but at almost 40 years old, Don could tell when he was being lied to, and he needed to know why. He kept his old Ford pickup a block or so behind her until she turned onto the highway. He pulled up to the on-ramp and waited. He stayed there a few moments longer than he had to, but he knew he could easily catch up on the open road. He kept her just in sight, knowing she wouldn't be able to recognize his truck now. In the dark, headlights are headlights. They wound further and further into the mountains. When she finally signaled that she was taking the next exit, Don accelerated to catch up, not wanting to lose her on the city streets when she got off. But as he exited behind her, he realized there wasn't much of a city to lose her in. Hell, it was barely even a town. There was a bar, a gas station, and a convenience store, and then darkness, as they passed on the poorly paved road that led into the woods. He slowed down and let her get farther ahead. There was something about that little town that had been so familiar. Don felt like he'd been there before. They cruised on in the night for half an hour or so, the feeling of déjà vu nagging at the back of Don's mind. It was when she pulled off the road onto a dirt driveway that he realized where he was. His mind flashed back to the summer he'd spent up here with his brother Bill. Dawn stopped breathing as her headlights swung around, the light falling across the cabin as she pulled into park, next to Bill's Jeep. Dawn drove past the driveway and down the road about half a mile. He stopped the truck. His jaw clenched until it hurt. His knuckles went white from gripping the steering wheel. Slowly, his breathing came back under control. He turned around and drove down the poorly paved road through the dark, past the convenience store, past the gas station, and pulled up to the bar. It was a mistake. After the bar shut down, he'd driven back up to the cabin, swerving more than once but managing not to wrap his truck around a tree. He'd pulled the revolver out from under his seat and just held it. His mind whirlwind through a torrent of emotions, alternately crying in despair and seething with rage, until the sun came up. She just looked so damned happy. Dawn didn't know what he'd expected. Maybe he'd half hoped to find her racked with guilt at what she'd done. But she just sat there, folding her papers without the slightest hint of worry or remorse. It was her smile that did it. The sight of her smile grabbed onto all the pain that had been growing in his heart and twisted it mercilessly. How could she have done this, after all that they'd been through together? The veins on his forehead started pulsing with hatred. And with his own brother. His teeth clenched, his eyes widened, and his vision began to go red around the edges. That bitch. That fucking bitch. A feral roar burst from the bottom of his stomach. Her head snapped around in alarm. Good. He fumbled with the knob for half a second, took one step back, and kicked the door in. "Dawn!" she screamed in shock. What are you doing here?" "Why?" he roared, bringing up the gun and leveling it at her chest. She fell backwards out of her chair. She scrambled to her feet, backing away, but finding no escape in the corner of the kitchen. He took a step towards her. "Why?" he yelled again. "What?" she whimpered. She pressed herself into the corner as if trying to will herself through the solid wall. "Baby, She was cut off by the sound of 2 shots. A question was frozen on her face. She slid down the wall, leaving 2 crimson streaks that dripped slowly in the yellow light. Dawn began trembling again. Suddenly, the bedroom door flew open at the end of the hall. Dawn turned around. Bill looked more confused than anything. Before he even had a chance for his confusion to turn to fear, Dawn put 3 shots in his chest. He turned away, unable to look at the spreading pool of blood around his brother's lifeless body. The revolver slipped out of his hand and landed on the floor with a thud. He looked around the kitchen. He saw the blood and quickly looked away. His rage was giving way to an all-encompassing panic. Then from behind him, a blood-curdling scream. He spun back around to see his sister-in-law, Cindy, kneeling in the bedroom doorway over her husband's body. "What have you done?" she screamed. "You bastard! What have you done?" It was Dawn's turn to be overcome with confusion. His jaw opened and closed, but no words came. Cindy began sobbing uncontrollably, hugging Bill close to her, the blood running over her arms. Dawn backed away and ran into the table. As he turned and looked down, the blood ran out of his face. White as a ghost, he reached down and picked up one of the cards. "You're invited," it exclaimed. His hand shook violently as he opened it. "What?" "Dawn's surprise 40th birthday party," it began. He threw it away from him in horror. He stared at his wife, her eyes glazed over forever with confusion and fear. He reached down and picked up the revolver. 1 shot left. A bang. Blood sprayed across the ceiling fan.